Hello, everyone. Aloha. My name is Terrell Morton. I am an associate professor of identity and justice in STEM education here at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And I'm going to be sharing a little bit about my research more broadly, centered around justice and joy, particularly as we think about STEM education for Black students in the undergraduate space. Um, I come at this work with a theoretical framing grounded in critical race theory, but more specifically, there's an adaptation of critical race theory that is sort of centering how I am approaching this particular presentation. And this project talks about this framing talks about interest convergence, or when those in power invest in those who don't have the power by virtue of a shared common point of interest. It then talks about interest divergence, where those in power are no longer having a shared interest with those without power. And so you start to see a divergence in terms of how these two groups come together. And then imperialistic reclamation, how those in power, by virtue of now diverging in their interests from those without power, now attempt to reclaim all rights, power, privileges, and access to these spaces that they had before. And so this framework, or the convergence, divergence, reclamation framework, was established back in like 2014 to look at affirmative action law that was happening here in the States, or in the continental lands of the States. And I use it to think about STEM education. And so you saw the images that I had put out in terms of how the National Science Foundation had this call for racial equity in STEM that came out around 2020, 2021. So post the murdering of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and sort of this rallying cry to say that we invest in Black lives. Well, it was around 2024 when we were getting into the new presidential election, where there were a lot of debates around anti-DEI and anti-woke isms that was taking place. And a lot of major US senators and even Congress people were running on these platforms of dismantling these things. And as a result, there was this hit list that was created of all of these federally funded projects that invested in diversity, that Ted Cruz out of Texas had accused of being like these far left ideologies. And so, again, tracing that convergence, the federal government coming together to invest in racial equity, the divergence, you're starting to see people reject these concepts of diversity, equity, inclusion, access, or justice. Coming now into 2025, 2026, with the rise of the multiple executive orders that have come out of the current administration, that has now led to a significant reduction in funding for scientific research more broadly, but even more specifically, any kind of research that focuses on people, particularly those from racially, gender-based, or sexually based minoritized groups. So, in coming out of this sort of framing, understanding that we're in this era of an imperialistic reclamation, I began to think with Robin D.G. Kelley's work, who asked very critical questions about freedom dreaming. More specifically, how do we produce a vision that enables us to see beyond our immediate ordeals? And in doing so, how are we able to transcend bitterness and cynicism to embrace this love, hope, and all-encompassing dream of freedom? And Robin D.G. Kelley, studying a lot of Black liberation movements, was raising these fundamental questions in the early 2000s. And I find these questions to still be relevant today in terms of how do we produce a freedom dream, and how do we dream in ways that really embraces love, hope, and not necessarily re-engages the same mindsets of the oppressors. And so if I were into dialogue with Dr. Kelley, I would say my response to that freedom dreaming is an actual form of radical hope, where I am dreaming of this new world. I'm thinking about specifically in this new world, how do we honor the past without repeating any of its violences? How do we move through pain towards joy and this freedom of spirit? So, not an ignoring of the pain or pretending like the pain doesn't exist, but finding ways to work through it, understanding what possibilities lie on the other end of it. And then in the process of doing so, particularly for those of us who work in academic spaces, how do we do this work without abandoning the communities from which we've came and the communities that are deeply involved in or receive outcomes from this work? So getting out of this ivory tower mentality of doing research for research's sake or trying to be quote unquote saviors for the people, but having a mindset of what it means to be in authentic community with those people. So this radical hope framing brought me then to Afrofuturism. Afrofuturism as this rise coming out of Black speculative fiction that really helps challenge how we understand the multiple truths of the past to ensure a promising future, or what some call this reclamation of Black ontologies, how it emphasizes Black creativity, Black capabilities, and Black possibilities. So this intentional disruption to these hot hegemonic narratives about who Black people are and what Black people are capable of doing. And then engaging in this science or STEAM innovation and speculative fiction. So, what is that world building possibilities when we're thinking about the type of future that we want to exist in? And so, in thinking with Afrofuturism and radical hope, I found my work to align in these spaces. So, in reclaiming Black ontologies, I go to Black geographer Catherine McKittrick, who again asks us, how do we write Blackness in a way that ethically honors it, but does not repeat the anti-Black violence? And she even says herself that means that we have to read the archives, not by what is measured or what has happened, but as indicators of what else has happened. And so Dr. McKittrick challenges us to not pay attention to what is written or to spoken, but to what is unwritten, to what is unspeakable, to what is unutterable, which to me presents life in this duality. What does the mainstream narrative say about Black folks and their possibilities? What does it say about how we understand science epistemologies and what counts as scientific knowledge, scientific exploration, or procedures and practices? And then what is unwritten, what is unspoken by virtue of the fact that those who were documenting said stories and concretizing it into what we now call history had a particular way of viewing. And so some of the work that I engage in really looking through those Black ontologies are strategies of like advancing a Black liberatory K-12 science education, where we flip the script in terms of what it is that we're thinking through as we're unearthing and re-engaging Black contributions to science. And then even so, being intentional to see what does that Black liberatory framework look like when we are engaging in authentic scientific practice with Black youth in community spaces. I also think about some of the work of colleagues who talk about how do we engage in counter storytelling in chemistry. So whose stories are we telling when we talk about certain scientific advancements, when we talk about discoveries, formulas, and how are we intentionally bringing in the stories once again that have been unwritten or unspoken in a lot of our mainstream narratives or text or even classroom spaces. I think about how folks have been unearthing scientific knowledge in Black histories. And so my colleague here, Dr. Monica Miles, talks a lot about Harriet Tubman as being this naturalist and the ways that she understood the earth and the environment to navigate the Underground Railroad without these concepts of maps that we now rely on. There was no Google or Apple Maps. There was no Yahoo or MapQuest. She used the stars. She used the flow of the river, where moss grew on the trees to understand how to maneuver. And so, how do we now position Harriet, as Monica is saying in this book, as this naturalist, as this environmental scientist, and incorporating her story into how we teach science? Or even colleagues over up at NYU who, in studying archives, get back into some of those science teaching epistemologies of Black women science educators to understand what kind of pedagogical practices people of the past have leveraged in the teaching of science that might have been erased when we got into Brown v. Board in the 1950s and the forced desegregation of schooling that ultimately led to the forced integration of schooling and the dismantling of a lot of our Black institutions. And then in engineering, so we hit all aspects of STEM and how my colleague, Dr. James Holly Jr. down at Southern University in Baton Rouge is really thinking about Black engineering epistemologies. So whose funds and forms of knowledge are we building with as we are teaching about a lot of these practices? And how are we engaging again those Black ontologies in that space? I think then with bell hooks around this concept of disrupting this anti-Black hegemony, particularly in when Hooks challenges us to choose love by moving through pain to the other side to find joy and the freedom of spirit. And so what Hooks tells us is that it is a political choice. We exist in a space of continued stress, continued challenges, continued trauma, but to make the political choice to choose love says that I am now looking outside of just how I am being impacted by this space, but I'm also wanting to help cultivate a critical consciousness so that we can say, yes, these realities and these traumas are happening. And as human beings, we have the ability to experience the full gambit of emotions, including joy, laughter, and happiness. And so, some of the ways that I've been thinking about this political choice of choosing love and joy is through coming up with Black unspeakable joy as a form of praxis. And so, some of the work that my colleague Ashley Woodson and I are being putting forward is looking at our own practices as Black educators working in academic spaces. How have we tapped into a form of an unspeakable joy by informed compromise, by weighing the cost in terms of what does it mean to take on certain types of advocacy, by thinking about this idea of having this internal source of strength that is deeply connected to my spirituality and faith, to having the opportunity to manage and fully embrace all of my emotions and not trying to separate my cognition from my affective self as I am navigating this space. And then always trying to be cognizant of the fact that scarcity models and scarcity mindsets recreate deficiencies and assumptions of deficiencies. But if we operate from this mindset of abundance, then how does it give us the opportunity to truly dream of new spaces and opportunities? And similarly, I think with other colleagues like Jennifer Adams, who talks intentionally about how we can promote Black joy in science learning by offering this heuristic of Black excellence, Black kinship, Black aesthetic, and Black inventiveness. Or my colleague, Dr. Ortiz, who talks intentionally about Black language and how that can be integrated within the mathematics learning spaces and the different dialects that come with how we understand things like AAVE or African American Vernacular English or other forms of English that we see with like Haitian Creole and all of these other spaces and how they intimately allow us to do complex mathematical calculations that might not be as formulaic as some of the more Western ways of knowing mathematics or teaching mathematics. Then I think about the world building concept and specifically turn to the writings of Joyce King, who in her research talks intentionally about how it is our responsibility to build with community as opposed of building for community. And so building with community means that I'm not just going in and extrapolating the knowledge and the understandings and the realities of people to now produce new scholarship, but they are co-researchers, they are co-theorizers with me because their walks of life just as much impacts and should drive how we're making sense of this intellectual enterprise as the intellectual enterprise should be feeding into their walks of life. And so intentionally building worlds with the people for the people, as opposed to presuming that I have all the answers in this world building space. And so, what does that look like within the concept of STEM? Well, there's a project that I've been working on with this mixed powered, mixed raced, mixed academic, professionally spaced community to create Afrofuturistic biology lessons and how we can teach some of these constructs like mitosis and meiosis through stories, as was shared earlier, connected to spaces and histories and times that give us the opportunity to freedom dream new possibilities. have also had the opportunity to think about what an Afrofuturistic climate environmental justice literacy might mean as we're thinking about responding to climate crises and having a more world building point of view in those responses that refute a lot of these industrial capitalistic approaches that drive some of our environmental justice aspects, or how we can begin to combine Afrofuturism with a culturally historical responsive literacy in the design and implementation of out-of-school STEM learning spaces for Black girls. I've also been thinking about world building outside of STEM to think about the theoretical frameworks that we draw from when we're actually interpreting and analyzing our data. And me being situated within the context of educational psychology recognizes that a lot of those theoretical frameworks were devised based off of white male undergraduate students in these large psychology-based classes. So their lived experiences and their ways of knowing, doing, and being that has now been codified into theory that's applied to diverse populations don't always match to how people from different groups make sense of the world. And so some of the work that I've engaged in is building theory for Black girls with Black girl ontoepistemologies at the root of that theory, or thinking about building theories for Black folks with Black ontoepistemologies at the roots of these Black theories, so that as we're going out and we're collecting and we're analyzing and we're making sense of our data, or we're designing new studies, or even using theory to drive our teaching and learning practices, we can be intentional to build worlds with the people instead of building worlds for the people. And similarly, I think about other colleagues who are in that world building space and how they push us even beyond just, again, STEM practice to think intentionally about policy and whose ontologies are ultimately being engaged with and through what community practices they're being engaged as we're designing and implementing educational policy. So as we consider things like access and engagement, as we consider things like merit and promotion, as we consider things like access to recommendation letters and GPA and what that means for scholarship and entry, whose ideas are we building these new worlds with? And can we have freedom dreamed possibilities with Black and Indigenous ontologies in that policy space? And so as I close, that might have been kind of fast, but I know that we were a little shifty on time. I do kind of want to just pose these musings for us as a community. As we're building our lessons, as we're thinking about our practices, as we're thinking about our research, whose stories, legacies, realities, and knowledge systems are we privileging? And whose stories, legacies, realities, and knowledge systems are we marginalizing? And to what extent are we reclaiming some of those ontologies in the spaces as we're trying to do this work? How are we thinking intentionally about, with, and through joy in the design of our teaching, our learning, our research, and our praxis? So much of what we understand about Black life or Brown lives or lives from other racially minoritized groups are always associated with trauma and oppression, which ultimately robs these people of their humanity. So how can we be intentional to consider their humanity as we're pursuing concepts of joy? And then as we're building these new worlds through our research and our space, who are we co-theorizing that work with? How are we bringing in those ontologies to intentionally build new STEM teaching practices and opportunities to ensure that our work is benefiting the people, considering the people, and not just taking from the people and building into these larger industrial capitalistic spaces. And that is all that I have for you all. Don't know if we want questions or if we want to return to the musings. But yeah, just some of the work that I've been thinking with.
Yeah, mahalo, Terrell. We actually have time for questions. Okay. Mahalo for that. So informative. We have to 11:10. They pushed it back 10 minutes. So, and the next session will be 11:20. But do you want to take any questions or even for Nokta?
I was gonna say, and I'm happy to share the platform with my co-presenter too, if you all have questions for her as well.
Audience?
It's a very logistical question, but there were so many great resources in there. Is there a way to access those slides?
Yes, I thought about that. I was like, I have all these different QR codes, but what I can do is drop a link to like all of the resources that I had mentioned in terms of the different publications and the scholars and the work that I've been thinking with. And I guess I can either post it to the Hoover app or I can share it with Tara and we can make sure that it gets out.
And there is about 9 minutes left, and I will push that the idea of, though I started us off late, that was on me. The idea that of talk story is to have some talk it out time. You got 9 minutes, talk it out.
Well, I can go back to the questions that I have for the community and we can maybe start there. But I am curious, like, whose stories, legacies, realities, knowledge systems are we building with as we're thinking about our work? And who does that privilege and who does that leave out?
No, I have a question. On that note, Terrell,
Mhm.
I know it's when I watch the news or read about it, it's mostly state driven, where they're trying to change the education system in their states to not address DEI and other things and different uh, ethnic or cultural approaches to learning. They want to make it more mainstream, just how it used to be. I mean, how do we um, how do we move forward in, I mean, those states especially, and challenge that?
Yeah, so what we're seeing is almost a resegregation by state. You have some states like Texas, Missouri, Oklahoma. Yeah, North Carolina's teetering, right? Who was passing these very clear laws about what can be taught and what cannot be taught when it comes to history, when it comes to DEI, or however they're defining those three words. And then on the flip side, you have states like Colorado and California and New York who are coming up with very specific legislation to say we are integrating this into our curriculum, and we're not backing down. And I think a lot of it is because of the federal pressures, the Department of Education, and the money that they're potentially holding up from states if they are found guilty um, of not violating, yeah, I guess violating the new executive orders, which is being contested back and forth in the courts. So to your question of like, how do we move forward? I know a lot of folks in these spaces that are contentious that have found ways to continue to support the people, to teach environmental justice and environmental science and, all of the bad words, but they might not call it what it was. They might call it something different. So I think that there are some of those kinds of strategies of like, how do we make sure not to lose the knowledge and the opportunity? But then I also think any good team, whether it's a military team or a sports team, has players who play different roles. And so, just as much as we have people who might be advancing this work in a more undercover type of way, I think it's also important to still have people pushing out loudly to say, we don't want to go back. We're really only wanting to move forward. And these policies that are harming people are only going to take us back. So
Yeah,
I think it takes both.
yeah. The word undercover you use, that's kind of a way to explain it right now, because even the University of Hawaii, because I sit on the committee, for the Hawaiian councils, we're we're told not to draw attention to our Native Hawaiian initiatives because that's race-based. But of course, knowing the whole history and the context, it's actually more political when you think about it. Yeah, we're facing those challenges even in a state like here where we I feel we still promote DEI and equity and access for everyone. But again, sense of place. That's what this
Mhm.
room is, right? Where are we? Yeah. So what are we learning? So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Anybody else? We have like 4 more minutes, maybe.
I have a question, I guess, for the group, since it is connected to place. So one of the things that I've been considering, so I'm from North Carolina. I'm pretty sure you saw like the Chapel Hill and the A&T in the background. But I now live in Chicago, and so place for me has like multiple kind of geographic spaces. So I'm curious as to how people are grapple with the sense of place in their work, particularly for people who migrate to different spaces. Either they have gone to college and now they're in a totally different space, or by virtue of their families, they've migrated to different spaces. And so home place might be different from current place. How are you all grapple with or respond to place for people who have more transient lifestyles?
Sorry, Lenore, we can't hear you. You're unmuted, but not sure. Put something in the chat. I'll respond to Terrell's. I mean, even related to Pornoto's research and experience, coming up in August, I have East West Center students coming in again. We have an East West Center program that's partnered with UH Manoa for graduate students. 30 to 40 countries represented. And when we come here, we actually acclimate them to Hawaii and the culture and the language. So because sometimes they get super confused when they come here. They don't hear Hawaiian language to begin with, and they're like, "Why is that?" So they sharing the history helps them understand that. But then, they come from Asia, North America, Pacific Islands, even Europe, some of them, and Central Asia as well, Middle East. They come and they share, their culture and their place and how maybe there's similarities or not, but then they really appreciate being introduced to the real, authentic Hawaii as opposed to the Waikiki version. And in a way, what I mean, Pernota's study as well is like promoting the Hawaiian mo'olelo. Would that be attacked by the current administration? Why are you teaching mo'olelo of Akua and gods to students? And so there's so much, to, yeah, there's so much. It's crazy. It's dynamic. To adjust to that is a lot. Well, I see it in the chat. Teresa has something. One of the perspectives I appreciate is an invitation to share the name of the place we call home, which may be different from where we're from. And then the reminder that we could be anywhere in the world, but we're not anywhere. We're here. So how can we contribute and care for and be accountable to this place we collectively call home? Yes. Mike, very good. Like that.
I think one thing too that I have quickly to add is the idea of like in the present day, kind of like building relationship with the place you're in. Like when I came to Hawaii, it was kind of like as you mentioned, like migration for me. And like just this whole idea of like having a really deep tie to place wasn't something that I had really thought through before. But going to these different experiences where we had the chance to contribute, like through service learning or through our work and build a relationship in a hands-on way, build relationships with folks like with Kanaka Hawaii and with people who had genealogies tracing back and like just having relationships with people also in a weird way kind of helped me build a sense of place and like coming from Bangladesh and like being born there, but I like have only been back there once in my life, but it's like genealogically the place that I am from and that generations of my family is from, like really thinking through that, like going to my family and like listening to their stories of growing up there is also like, for me, that's been something I've realized is really important to connecting to place.
Mhm.
Oh, mahalo for sharing that. Okay, we're at time, and both of you, we really appreciate what you share with us. Awesome work going on. So you have till 11:20 for the next session. Everybody, see you later. Aloha.